Commander Zexhai stood on the bridge of his command ship and watched the blue planet below. 3 months had passed since the Kalreth Empire began fighting the humans of Earth. The war felt like all the others he had fought in his long career. The humans shot back when attacked, they defended their colonies when invaded, and they retreated when outnumbered. Everything followed the usual patterns that military books described. The tall alien commander had gray skin and 4 arms that moved with practiced efficiency across the control panels. His species had conquered 12 different worlds in the past century. Humans were just another obstacle to remove from valuable territory. They had decent weapons and knew basic tactics, but nothing special, nothing that would change the outcome of this war. Jake Morrison crouched behind a broken wall in what used to be a shopping center on New Geneva Colony. His squad of 8 human soldiers waited for his signal. The Kalreth forces had landed here 2 days ago and were slowly pushing through the city. Jake's job was simple: slow them down while civilians escaped to the transport ships. The young lieutenant checked his rifle and looked at his team. They were good soldiers who followed orders and kept each other alive. Danny Rodriguez covered the left flank with his heavy weapon. Sarah Kim watched the right side through her scope. Ben Parker kept an eye on their back exit. These people had become his family during months of fighting. Jake spoke into his radio in a quiet voice. "Command, this is Bravo Squad, enemy patrol. Moving down Market Street. About 20 of them with one of their walking tanks." The reply came back quickly. "Copy Bravo Squad. Civilians need 15 more minutes to reach the ships. Keep those aliens busy." Jake nodded to his team. This was routine now. They would hit the Kalreth patrol, cause some damage, then fall back to the next defensive position. They had done this same dance dozens of times on different worlds. Fight, retreat, fight again. It was how this war worked. The Kalreth soldiers moved down the street in their usual formation. They wore dark armor that covered their tall bodies completely. Their weapons fired bright energy bolts that could punch through concrete. They were efficient and professional, but they moved like they had all the time in the world. Jake waited until they were close enough, then gave the signal. His squad opened fire from 3 different positions. Red laser bolts and bullets caught the aliens by surprise. Several fell before they could react. The walking tank turned its main gun toward Jake's position and fired back. The explosion threw dust and debris everywhere. Jake rolled behind better cover as his squad kept shooting. They had maybe 2 minutes before more Kalreth forces arrived. That was enough time to make the aliens angry and then disappear. On his command ship, Zexhai watched reports from the surface battle. Human resistance was predictable and limited. They would fight for a while, then retreat when things got too dangerous. They seemed to care more about saving their people than winning battles. This made them easy to predict and defeat. The commander made notes in his daily report. Human forces showed standard defensive behavior. They used guerrilla tactics when outnumbered but avoided direct confrontation with superior forces. Their technology was adequate but not advanced. Most importantly, they seemed unwilling to take heavy casualties to achieve military objectives. These observations matched what Kalreth military science had learned about dozens of other species. Humans fought to protect their homes and families, which made them brave but also limited their options. They would not sacrifice civilians for military advantage. They would not pursue enemies if it meant leaving their people undefended. These were weaknesses that could be used against them. Down on the planet, Jake's squad completed their mission. They had delayed the Kalreth advance long enough for the last transport ship to escape with 300 civilians. The cost was 1 wounded soldier and most of their ammunition. It was a fair trade by the standards of this war. As they moved through abandoned buildings toward their extraction point, Jake thought about the months ahead. The Kalreth Empire was big and had more ships and soldiers than humanity. This war would probably last for years. People would die on both sides until someone decided the cost was too high to continue. Dr. Lisa Chang worked in the mobile hospital that followed human forces from battle to battle. She had treated hundreds of wounded soldiers and seen how war changed people. The fighting had settled into a grim routine. Soldiers got hurt, she fixed them, and they went back to fight again. The patients she treated talked about home, about the people they were protecting, about wanting the war to end so they could go back to normal life. They fought because they had to, not because they wanted to. War was a job that needed doing, nothing more. Lisa had studied the psychological effects of long conflicts. This war showed all the usual patterns. Both sides were settling into sustainable fighting that could continue for years without either achieving complete victory. It was war as politics, just like the history books described. Commander Zex High finished his report and sent it to Calreth High Command. His recommendation was simple: continue current operations and maintain steady pressure on human forces. Within 6 months, the humans would agree to surrender the disputed territories rather than continue losing people and resources. The war felt routine because it was routine. Nothing in the past 3 months suggested that anything would change. The attack on Harmony Station happened on a Tuesday morning when most of the researchers were having breakfast with their families. Commander Zex High had ordered the bombardment as a routine tactical move. His intelligence reports showed the station had no military value, just scientists studying better ways to grow food on new planets. The Calreth fleet fired for exactly 7 minutes. When the weapons stopped, Harmony Station was a broken shell of metal and burning atmosphere drifting in space. 300 people had lived there the day before. Now there was only silence and debris. Captain Ryan Webb was patrolling the outer system when the distress signal reached his ship. The transmission was broken and full of static, but he could hear voices screaming for help. A woman kept repeating that the children needed to be evacuated first. Then the signal cut off completely. Ryan's ship reached Harmony Station 6 hours later. What he found made his crew go silent. The station's main section had been blown apart. The living areas where families slept were completely destroyed. Pieces of children's toys floated among the wreckage, along with bodies that would never go home. His communications officer was a young woman named Carol Davis, who had joined the fleet 2 months ago. She stared at her screen and said in a quiet voice, "Sir, I'm reading 67 children among the casualties." Ryan had been fighting this war for 8 months. He had seen plenty of death and destruction. Military targets got hit, soldiers died, ships exploded. That was war. But this was different. These people had been growing food and studying soil samples. They had been no threat to anyone. The captain sent his report to Fleet Command and waited for orders. Standard procedure called for filing a formal protest with the Calreth Empire through diplomatic channels. Maybe there would be a retaliatory strike against one of their military outposts. The war would continue as it had before. But something was happening in the human communication networks that Command had not expected. News of Harmony Station spread through every ship and every base within hours. Soldiers who had been fighting. This war, like a job, suddenly had a different look in their eyes. Sergeant Amy Rodriguez was supposed to start her shore leave when the news came through. She was sitting in the recreation area of her ship, writing a letter to her sister back on Earth. The letter talked about how boring the war had become and how she missed real food. Then the images from Harmony Station appeared on the news feed. Amy saw a small teddy bear floating in space, its fur burned but still recognizable. She saw a child's drawing stuck to a piece of metal that had once been a bedroom wall. The drawing showed a family standing in front of a house with the words, "I love you, Mommy," written in green crayon. Amy put down her letter and walked to the nearest computer terminal. She canceled her shore leave and requested immediate reassignment to active combat duty. Around her, other soldiers were making the same request. The recreation area that had been full of laughter and conversation became quiet and focused. On his command ship, Zex High noticed changes in human communication patterns within 12 hours of the Harmony Station attack. Radio traffic between human ships increased by 40%. Ship movements became more aggressive. Response times to Calreth operations shortened from hours to minutes. The Calreth commander was not concerned. Humans always got emotional when civilians died. They would be angry for a few days, maybe launch some desperate attacks that would cost them ships and soldiers. Then they would return to the same defensive patterns as before. But the changes continued and grew stronger. Human patrol ships that used to maintain safe distances from Calreth forces began closing to attack range without warning. Defensive. Positions that had been static for weeks suddenly emptied as human forces went on the offensive. Lieutenant Jake Morrison received new orders while his squad was resting between missions. Instead of another civilian evacuation or defensive position, they were assigned to hunt down and destroy a specific Calreth patrol unit. Not capture, not delay, not discourage. Destroy. Jake looked at his team and saw something he had never seen before. Danny Rodriguez was checking his heavy weapon with a cold smile. Sarah Kim was studying enemy movement patterns with the intensity of a predator watching prey. Ben Parker had stopped talking about home and started talking about how many aliens he could kill before his ammunition ran out. The change was not limited to combat soldiers. Dr. Lisa Chang noticed it in her patients. Wounded men and women who used to ask when they could go home now asked when they could return to the fight. Conversations in the medical bay shifted from memories of peaceful life to detailed discussions of Calreth weak points. A soldier with a broken arm spent an hour describing exactly how he planned to use a combat knife against alien armor. Another patient with leg wounds drew diagrams showing the best ways to board enemy ships. They spoke about killing Calreth forces the way they used to speak about their jobs back home. Captain Ryan Webb felt the change in himself as well. For months, he had followed careful engagement protocols designed to minimize casualties and maintain tactical advantage. Now he found himself studying his ship's weapons systems and thinking about how much damage he could do to enemy vessels. His crew volunteered for double shifts without being asked. The weapons officer spent his free time calculating optimal firing, solutions for close-range combat. The engineering team worked overtime to increase engine power and weapon charging rates. Everyone wanted to be ready for the next encounter with Calreth forces. The transformation was spreading through the entire human fleet like a virus that infected every ship and every soldier. Command noticed the changes but did not try to stop them. Battle efficiency was increasing dramatically. Human forces were taking initiative instead of just responding to enemy moves. Zex High's tactical computers began registering anomalous behavior in human units. Ships that had maintained predictable patrol routes for weeks suddenly appeared in unexpected locations. Ground forces that had followed standard defensive doctrine now moved in aggressive patterns that confused Calreth battle analysis. The first real sign that something fundamental had changed came when Sergeant Rodriguez's unit encountered a damaged Calreth patrol ship. The alien vessel had suffered engine failure and was broadcasting surrender signals according to standard military protocol. Rodriguez ordered her boarding team to take the ship. When her soldiers asked about processing prisoners, she gave them a look that made them stop asking questions. 30 minutes later, the Calreth ship was empty and quiet. No prisoners were transferred to human custody. No formal report was filed with command. Similar incidents began happening throughout the war zone. Human forces that encountered surrendering or disabled Calreth units simply eliminated them completely. The careful documentation and prisoner processing that had characterized the first months of fighting disappeared overnight. Commander Zex High received reports from surviving Calreth units describing human behavior as unprecedented and outside established parameters. His military analysts could not explain why an enemy that had fought defensively for months was suddenly acting like a completely different species. The routine war that had been fought by rules and procedures was ending. Something else was beginning, something that had no rules at all. Lieutenant Jake Morrison led his squad through the morning mist on Kepler Prime. Their new orders were simple and direct. Find the Calreth forward base and eliminate all enemy personnel. No prisoners, no negotiations, no retreat. For the first time in 8 months of fighting, they were told to kill everything that moved. The change in his soldiers was immediate and unsettling. Danny Rodriguez moved through the forest like a hunting animal, his heavy weapon ready and his eyes constantly scanning for targets. Sarah Kim had stopped talking completely, except to report enemy positions. Ben Parker smiled when he loaded his rifle, a cold expression that Jake had never seen before. They found the Calreth base at dawn. It was a temporary camp with about 50 enemy soldiers and several vehicles. In the old days, Jake would have called for artillery support or airstrikes to soften the target before attacking. Now he simply gestured for his team to spread out and begin killing. The attack lasted 12 minutes. When it was over, the Calreth base was silent and still. Jake's squad had taken no prisoners and left no survivors. They moved through the camp, systematically checking each building and each body to make sure their work was complete. Dr. Lisa Chang noticed the psychological changes in her patients becoming more extreme each day. Wounded soldiers no longer spoke about missing home or wanting the war to end. Instead, they talked about getting back to the fight and killing more aliens. A Marine with severe burns asked her how soon he could return to combat duty. When she said 2 weeks, he seemed genuinely angry. The medical record showed something that disturbed her deeply. Human casualties were increasing as soldiers took greater risks in combat, but the psychological profiles showed no signs of trauma or stress. Instead, her patients displayed what could only be described as satisfaction. They were happy with their work. A soldier brought in with a broken leg spent his recovery time drawing detailed diagrams of Calreth anatomy, marking the locations of vital organs and weak points in their armor. Another patient with head injuries asked for technical manuals about alien ship construction. They studied these materials with the focus of students preparing for important exams. Commander Zexhai received troubling reports from his field commanders. Human tactics had evolved beyond anything in Calreth military databases. Enemy forces no longer followed predictable patterns or responded to standard countermeasures. They attacked without regard for their own safety and fought until every alien in the area was dead. A Calreth patrol had encountered what appeared to be a single human soldier near the ruins of Delta Colony. Following standard procedure, they moved to capture the lone enemy for interrogation. The human led them into an abandoned building where 11 more humans were waiting. The entire Calreth patrol was killed in the ambush. Security cameras showed the humans spending additional time making sure each alien was definitely dead. The most disturbing reports came from Calreth survivors who had witnessed human behavior up close. They described enemy soldiers who continued fighting even when seriously wounded, who seemed to feel no fear or hesitation when facing superior numbers, and who showed no mercy to defeated opponents. Captain Ryan Webb's ship intercepted a Calreth distress signal from the Tau system. 3 human cruisers had cornered a damaged alien vessel that was trying to retreat. Standard military doctrine called for accepting surrender and taking prisoners for intelligence gathering. Instead, the human ships had moved to point-blank range and continued firing until the enemy vessel was completely destroyed. Ryan found himself approving of the human commander's actions. The Calreth Empire had killed children at Harmony Station. They deserved no mercy and no chance to escape. His own crew was making similar decisions in their encounters with alien forces. His weapons officer, Lieutenant Carl Brown, had modified the ship's targeting systems to maximize damage rather than disable enemy vessels. The engineering team had removed safety protocols from the engines to allow dangerous overload conditions that provided more power for weapons and shields. Everyone understood that their ship might not survive the war, but they were determined to take as many aliens with them as possible. Sergeant Amy Rodriguez had been fighting continuously for 6 days without rest. Her unit moved from target to target like a machine designed specifically for killing Calreth forces. They no longer bothered with tactical analysis or careful planning. They simply found the enemy and destroyed them completely. Her squad had eliminated 4 alien outposts and 2 patrol ships during their current mission. They moved through Calreth positions with mechanical precision, showing no emotion except for quiet satisfaction when their work was finished. Rodriguez realized she had stopped thinking of the aliens as soldiers fighting for their own people. They were simply targets to be eliminated. The transformation in human forces was spreading beyond the military. Civilian workers at supply bases and communication stations requested transfers to combat units. Engineers and medical personnel volunteered for dangerous missions behind enemy lines. Everyone wanted to contribute directly to killing aliens. Dr. Chang received requests from hospital staff to be reassigned to battlefield medical units where they could treat soldiers closer to the fighting. When she asked why they wanted to leave safe positions, they explained that they wanted to help human forces be more effective at destroying the enemy. The change was not limited to anger or revenge. Human personnel displayed a cold, calculating approach to the elimination of Calreth forces that was more unsettling than any emotional response. They studied alien weaknesses with scientific precision and applied their knowledge with mechanical efficiency. Lieutenant Jake Morrison's squad encountered a group of Calreth soldiers who had become separated from their main force. The aliens tried to surrender by dropping their weapons and broadcasting the standard submission codes. Jake's team eliminated them anyway, then spent 20 minutes making sure no alien had survived by playing dead. When Jake filed his after-action report, he listed the encounter as elimination of enemy patrol, with no mention of surrender attempts. His superiors approved the report without comment. The rules of war that had governed the first months of fighting no longer applied to anyone. Commander Zexhi's intelligence staff produced an analysis that confused and frightened the Calreth. High Command. Human military behavior had changed so dramatically that they appeared to be fighting a completely different war than they had been a month earlier. The enemy showed no interest in territorial gain, strategic advantage, or political objectives. They seemed focused entirely on killing as many Calreth as possible. The most disturbing aspect of the intelligence report was its conclusion. Human forces were not acting out of anger or desperation. They had adopted the systematic elimination of Calreth personnel as their primary military objective and were pursuing this goal with calm, professional efficiency. The routine war that both sides had understood was over. What replaced it was something that Calreth military science had no experience with and no defense against. Human military doctrine changed overnight in ways that confused both allies and enemies. Sleep schedules were reduced from 8 hours to 4 hours by voluntary agreement among personnel. Off-duty soldiers requested immediate transfer to active combat units. Medical personnel discharged themselves from hospitals before their wounds had fully healed to return to the fight. Lieutenant Jake Morrison found himself leading operations that would have been considered impossible suicide missions just weeks before. His squad attacked fortified Calreth positions with direct frontal assaults that succeeded through pure aggressive momentum. They moved through enemy defenses like they had supernatural protection, losing soldiers but always achieving their objectives. The mathematics of war had changed in favor of human forces despite their smaller numbers. Calreth tactical computers could not predict human behavior that no longer followed logical patterns. Alien commanders planned defensive positions based on standard military doctrine, only to watch human forces ignore obvious dangers and attack from directions that should have been impossible. Dr. Lisa Chang struggled to understand the psychological transformation occurring throughout human military forces. Soldiers who had been cautious and methodical for months now volunteered for missions with casualty projections approaching 100%. They were not acting suicidally, but rather with cold determination to inflict maximum damage on enemy forces before they fell. A wounded Marine explained his thinking to her in simple terms. The Calreth had killed human children. Therefore, all Calreth military personnel needed to die. The equation was straightforward and required no complex strategy or political considerations. Personal survival was less important than completing the necessary work. The Calreth Empire attempted to restore the previous rhythm of warfare by launching a major attack against civilian targets. Their fleet moved against New Christchurch, a farming colony with 2 million inhabitants. Intelligence suggested the attack would force human forces to adopt defensive positions and return to predictable behavior patterns. The result was catastrophic for Calreth forces. Human ships appeared within 6 hours of the attack rather than the expected 2 days. They engaged the alien fleet with a ferocity that overwhelmed every defensive system. Calreth vessels that had survived dozens of previous battles were destroyed in minutes by human forces that seemed immune to their own safety concerns. Captain Ryan Webb led the counterattack against the alien fleet. His ship closed to point-blank range with a Calreth dreadnought and fired continuously until both vessels were critically damaged. When his crew reported that the ship was about to explode, Webb ordered them to ram the alien vessel instead of retreating. The collision destroyed both ships, but not before Webb's crew had transmitted detailed targeting information to other human vessels. The sacrifice of one ship enabled the destruction of 3 larger alien vessels. The exchange rate heavily favored human forces, despite their apparent disadvantage. Commander Zexhai watched his fleet suffer unprecedented losses as human tactics became completely unpredictable. Ships that should have retreated when faced with superior numbers instead moved closer and fought harder. Human commanders sacrificed valuable military assets to achieve objectives that served no apparent strategic purpose beyond inflicting maximum casualties on Calreth forces. His own flagship was attacked by a single human destroyer that should have been no threat to a vessel 10 times its size. The human ship closed to ramming distance and fired everything it had before being destroyed. The attack caused enough damage to force Zexhai's ship to withdraw from the battle, reducing Calreth command effectiveness for the remainder of the engagement. Sergeant Amy Rodriguez led a boarding action against a Calreth supply ship with 12 human soldiers. The alien vessel housed 300 crew members and had defensive systems designed to repel much larger boarding parties. Rodriguez's team successfully captured the ship in 47 minutes of continuous fighting. The engagement was recorded by security cameras throughout the alien vessel. Calreth analysts who studied the footage could not explain how 12 humans had eliminated 300 defenders without suffering a single casualty. The human soldiers moved through the ship with mechanical precision, showing no hesitation, and making no tactical errors. When Calreth reinforcements arrived 3 hours later, they found their supply ship intact, but empty of living crew. The ship's computer systems had been completely wiped of all navigation data, tactical information, and communication codes. The human boarding party had vanished without leaving any trace of how they had escaped. Lieutenant Jake Morrison's squad received intelligence about a Calreth command post hidden in the mountains of Kepler Prime. The facility was protected by natural barriers, automated defenses, and a full company of elite alien soldiers. Military analysis suggested that capturing the position would require at least a battalion of human forces and extensive artillery support. Morrison requested permission to attack the position with his 8-man squad. When his superiors questioned the feasibility of such an operation, he explained that his team had been studying Calreth defensive patterns for weeks and had identified several weaknesses in their setup. The attack began at dawn and lasted until sunset. Morrison's squad eliminated the entire Calreth garrison and captured the command post with its intelligence databases intact. They suffered 60% casualties, but achieved complete mission success. The tactical information they recovered enabled human forces to locate and destroy 6 additional alien installations. Dr. Chang analyzed the medical data from the final phase of major combat operations. Human casualties were severe, with injury rates approaching levels seen in historical conflicts known for their brutality. However, psychological profiles of surviving personnel showed no evidence of combat trauma or emotional distress. Instead, she found indicators of what could only be described as professional satisfaction. Soldiers spoke about their work in the same terms that craftsmen use to describe completed projects. They had eliminated threats to human civilians and felt appropriately pleased with their accomplishments. The transformation had reached every level of human military organization. Fleet admirals modified strategic doctrine to emphasize the complete destruction of enemy forces rather than territorial control. Logistics personnel worked around the clock to supply ammunition and weapons to combat units. Intelligence officers focused exclusively on identifying Calreth positions for elimination. Commander Zexhai submitted an emergency request for reinforcements to Calreth High Command. His message included detailed analysis of human tactical evolution and projections for future operations. The conclusion was unavoidable. Current Calreth forces were insufficient to contain human military expansion. The response from his superiors was swift and decisive. Admiral Nexmore would arrive within 2 weeks with the 3rd Battle Fleet to restore Calreth control over the war zone. The admiral had experience with numerous warrior species and would know how to handle the human psychological anomaly. Captain Ryan Webb intercepted Calreth communications discussing reinforcement schedules and fleet movements. The alien messages revealed growing concern about human military effectiveness and requests for guidance on handling unprecedented tactical challenges. Webb shared the intelligence with other human commanders, who responded with quiet satisfaction. More alien ships meant more targets to destroy. The war was becoming exactly what they wanted it to be. An opportunity to eliminate Calreth military capability completely and permanently. The routine war was now a memory. What had replaced it was the systematic hunting of alien forces by humans who had rediscovered their nature as apex predators. Admiral Nexmore arrived from the Calreth core worlds with 40 ships and 200,000 soldiers. He had fought 17 different species across the galaxy and never encountered a military situation he could not resolve through superior tactics and overwhelming force. His reputation for crushing rebellions was legendary throughout the Empire. The Admiral's first action was to review battlefield recordings from the past month of fighting. What he saw defied every principle of military science that had guided Calreth expansion for 3 centuries. Human forces were not simply fighting more aggressively, they had abandoned every instinct for self-preservation in service of destroying alien personnel. Lieutenant Jake Morrison's squad had been in continuous combat for 2 weeks without rest or resupply. They moved through Calreth positions like a force of nature, eliminating resistance with mechanical precision. Enemy soldiers no longer tried to hold territory when human forces approached. They simply abandoned their positions and fled. Morrison watched a retreating column of Calreth vehicles through his binoculars. Standard military procedure called for allowing enemy withdrawal to avoid unnecessary casualties. Instead, he radioed for artillery strikes on the convoy. Every alien vehicle was destroyed before reaching safety. No prisoners were taken from the wreckage. The transformation in human behavior had reached a point where Calreth military analysts classified it as a species-wide behavioral anomaly. Captured enemy communications revealed acute confusion among alien commanders who could no longer predict or counter human tactical decisions. Dr. Lisa Chang was reassigned to analyze Calreth prisoners of war, though few aliens survived encounters with human forces long enough to be captured. Those who did reach human custody displayed severe psychological trauma that had nothing to do with their physical injuries. A Calreth officer who had commanded a company of soldiers broke down during interrogation when asked about his unit's encounter with human forces. He described watching his troops flee in panic as 12 human soldiers systematically hunted them through a forest. The humans had shown no emotion during the pursuit, tracking and killing fleeing aliens with the focused intensity of predators. The alien officer kept repeating that the humans were not fighting a war anymore. They were conducting an extermination, with the methodical efficiency of scientists eliminating a laboratory contamination. The psychological impact on surviving Calreth personnel was devastating their military effectiveness. Sergeant Amy Rodriguez intercepted a Calreth evacuation convoy attempting to withdraw non-combatant personnel from the war zone. The convoy consisted of transport ships carrying alien civilians, medical personnel, and administrative staff. Military doctrine from every civilized species called for allowing civilian evacuation during armed conflicts. Rodriguez studied the convoy through her targeting scope and made a decision that reflected the new reality of this war. The Calreth had shown no concern for human civilians at Harmony Station. Therefore, the concept of alien non-combatants was meaningless. She ordered the convoy destroyed completely. When her actions were later questioned by superior officers, Rodriguez submitted a brief report that stated, "No Calreth civilians were present at Harmony Station when they killed our children." The matter was dropped without further investigation. Command understood that the rules of engagement had changed permanently. Captain Ryan Webb's ship encountered Admiral Nexmore's flagship in the Kepler system. The Calreth vessel was 3 times larger than Webb's cruiser and carried enough firepower to destroy a small fleet. Standard tactics called for withdrawal when facing such overwhelming superiority. Instead, Webb ordered his ship to close to point-blank range and engage the alien flagship directly. His crew responded without question, knowing that their survival was less important than inflicting maximum damage on the enemy. The engagement lasted 3 hours and resulted in the complete destruction of Admiral Nexmore's command ship. Webb's vessel suffered critical damage during the battle and was destroyed by secondary explosions 20 minutes after the alien flagship. His final transmission to other human ships contained detailed information about Calreth vessel weaknesses and recommended tactics for destroying similar targets. The sacrifice of one human ship enabled the elimination of Admiral Nexmore and his entire command staff. The psychological impact on remaining Calreth forces was immediate and devastating. Their most experienced military leader had been killed by an enemy that fought without regard for tactical logic or personal survival. Commander Zexhai found himself commanding the remnants of the Calreth fleet after Admiral Nexmore's death. His forces had been reduced by 70% in 2 weeks of fighting against human forces that seemed to multiply rather than diminish despite heavy casualties. The mathematical reality was impossible to deny. Human forces were destroying Calreth, military assets at a rate that would result in complete alien defeat within months. The humans were not winning through superior technology or brilliant strategy. They were succeeding because they had decided that Calreth existence was incompatible with their own. Zexhai's personal communications with surviving commanders revealed the depth of Calreth's psychological collapse. Unit after unit reported that their soldiers refused to engage human forces directly. Alien personnel abandoned weapons and equipment rather than face enemies who fought with predatory focus that transcended normal military behavior. A transmission from the outer system described human forces methodically hunting down fleeing Calreth ships. The aliens were not retreating in good order or conducting strategic withdrawal. They were running in panic while human vessels pursued them with patient determination. Lieutenant Jake Morrison stood in the ruins of the last major Calreth military installation in human space. His squad had been fighting for 22 days, straight with minimal rest and resupply. The silence that followed the final engagement felt strange after months of constant combat. The installation had housed 5,000 Calreth soldiers and support personnel. Now it was empty, except for the bodies of aliens who had died trying to defend positions that could not be held against humans who refused to retreat or surrender. Morrison's after-action report was brief and factual. Enemy resistance had been eliminated completely. No prisoners had been taken because none had survived the assault. His squad was ready for immediate reassignment to the next target. Dr. Chang processed psychological evaluations from human personnel who had participated in the final elimination of Calreth forces. The data revealed something remarkable. Soldiers showed no signs of combat fatigue, trauma, or emotional distress. Instead, they displayed quiet satisfaction with work well done. Sergeant Rodriguez submitted her final combat report from the war zone. Her unit had eliminated over 3,000 enemy personnel during 6 months of operations. When asked about her feelings regarding the conclusion of fighting, she responded that the threat to human civilians had been permanently removed. The galactic community began receiving fragmented reports of a war that had transformed from territorial dispute into the systematic elimination of an entire military force. Intelligence analysts struggled to understand how a conflict that had appeared routine for months had suddenly become something unprecedented in recorded history. Commander Zex High prepared his final transmission to Calreth High Command. The message would recommend immediate and unconditional surrender before human forces expanded their operations beyond the current war zone. The alternative was the complete destruction of Calreth military capability and possibly the species itself. The message from Calreth High Command reached every human ship and base simultaneously. Admiral Nexmore's replacement broadcast unconditional surrender on all frequencies, requesting immediate ceasefire negotiations and complete withdrawal from disputed territories. The transmission included a classified assessment that would later be studied by military historians across the galaxy. Human military capacity was fundamentally miscalculated. Lieutenant Jake Morrison found himself standing in the command center of what had been the largest Calreth military base in human space. His squad had been fighting continuously for 26 days, moving from target to target with mechanical precision. The silence that followed the surrender announcement felt strange after months of constant combat. For the first time since Harmony Station, Morrison allowed himself to sleep for more than 2 hours. His dreams were empty and peaceful. When he woke, the cold focus that had driven him for months was simply gone, replaced by quiet satisfaction that the necessary work had been completed. Dr. Lisa Chang received the final casualty reports from the war's conclusion. Human losses had been severe during the final phase of operations, with some units suffering 90% casualties. However, psychological evaluations of surviving personnel revealed something unprecedented in military medicine. No evidence of trauma, stress disorders, or emotional damage. Instead, her patients displayed indicators of completion and contentment. They spoke about the elimination of Calreth forces the way craftsmen discussed finished projects. The threat to human civilians had been permanently removed, and they felt appropriately satisfied with their accomplishments. A wounded Marine explained his mental state in simple terms. The war had begun as a territorial dispute with professional soldiers fighting for political objectives. When the aliens killed human children, it became something entirely different. It became pest control, and pest control was now finished. Commander. Zex High's personal log was recovered from the wreckage of his command ship after the final battle. The entries from the last weeks of fighting revealed the psychological impact on Calreth forces who had witnessed human behavior during the extermination phase. The final entry read, "We believed we understood warfare because we understood tactics, strategy, and logistics. We failed to account for the possibility that an entire species could simultaneously abandon every instinct for self-preservation in service of a single objective. The humans did not defeat us in battle. They simply decided that our existence was incompatible with theirs and acted accordingly." Sergeant Amy Rodriguez attended the victory ceremony held 3 weeks after the ceasefire. Standing before assembled officers and dignitaries, she felt disconnected from the formal speeches about courage and sacrifice. The cold rage that had driven her actions for months had simply disappeared when the last alien ship withdrew from human space. The ceremony felt surreal after months of pure focus on eliminating enemy forces. As medals were presented and commendations read, Rodriguez realized that the transformation she had experienced was already fading. The threat to human civilians had been permanently removed, and her mind was returning to peacetime concerns. Captain, Ryan Webb's replacement filed the final patrol report from the former war zone. Human ships now moved through space that had been contested for months without encountering any Calreth presence. The alien withdrawal had been complete and immediate, leaving behind only abandoned installations and scattered debris. The report contained a single recommendation for Fleet Command: update all diplomatic protocols to ensure that future adversaries understand the difference between humanity at war and humanity engaged in protection of its young. The distinction was apparently not obvious to alien species who had never encountered truly protective behavior. Dr. Chang compiled her final analysis of the psychological phenomenon that had transformed human military forces. The data showed that the change had been triggered by the targeting of civilians, but had evolved into something far more comprehensive. Human personnel had not simply become more aggressive, they had temporarily redefined their fundamental purpose. The transformation was remarkable for its uniformity across the entire human military. From fleet admirals to individual soldiers, everyone had simultaneously adopted the same objective: complete elimination of the threat to human civilians. Personal survival, military protocol, and strategic considerations had become secondary to this single goal. Most significantly, the psychological change had reversed itself automatically when the threat was removed. Human personnel returned to normal behavior patterns within days of the Calreth surrender, with no apparent long-term effects or residual trauma. Lieutenant Morrison submitted his final combat report and requested transfer to peacetime duties. The document was notable for its clinical precision and complete lack of emotional content. Enemy forces had been eliminated completely and efficiently. Mission objectives had been achieved. He was ready to return to normal military service. The Galactic community struggled to process reports of a war that had transformed from conventional territorial dispute into systematic species elimination. Military analysts from dozens of civilizations studied the available data and reached disturbing conclusions about human capabilities when sufficiently motivated. The Calreth Empire issued formal apologies for civilian casualties and pledged to avoid future conflicts with human territories. Their military doctrine was completely revised to account for the possibility of encountering species that viewed warfare as existential rather than political. Other alien governments quietly updated their diplomatic policies regarding humanity. The consensus was clear: humans were to be treated as a protected species whose civilian populations should never be targeted under any circumstances. The alternative was apparently the complete destruction of one's military capabilities. Commander. Zexhi's final transmission to Calreth High Command became required reading at military academies throughout the galaxy. His analysis concluded that humans possessed a psychological capability that other species lacked: the ability to collectively abandon individual survival instincts when protecting their young. The report noted that this trait made humans extremely dangerous opponents when properly motivated, but also explained their otherwise peaceful behavior. They had no interest in conquest or expansion for its own sake, only in protecting their families and communities from external threats. Dr. Chang's research was classified at the highest levels of human government and shared only with selected allies. The data showed that humanity possessed psychological capabilities that could be triggered under specific circumstances, transforming the entire species into an extinction-level threat to any enemy. The implications were sobering for human leadership. The same protective instincts that made them capable of eliminating threats to their civilians also made them vulnerable to manipulation by hostile forces who understood how to trigger the transformation. 6 months after the war's end, space lanes that had been contested battlegrounds returned to normal commercial traffic. Human and alien vessels shared the same shipping routes without incident. The war that had briefly threatened to become an extermination campaign was remembered mainly in classified military files. Lieutenant Morrison returned to his home world and resumed civilian life as an engineer. The months of systematic combat faded into memory like a strange dream. When asked about his war service, he mentioned that he had helped protect human colonies from alien invasion and left the details unspecified. The routine war that had begun as a territorial dispute ended with the complete removal of one side's ability to continue fighting. The galaxy took note. Humans were a peaceful species that preferred negotiation and compromise, but when their children were threatened, they became something else entirely. Something that other species should avoid, encountering at all costs.